Welcome to the Bagel Logic Podcast, the show where Papa Tom spreads wisdom like a smear of cream cheese on an everything bagel. Here's your host, Thom Jennings.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bagel Logic Podcast. And I've had a lot of conversations with people that have asked me about the podcast and what it's about. People have been asking me if it's actually about bagels. Like, how can you do an entire podcast about bagels? It's really not about bagels. I think people that have listened to a few of the episodes will know that. It's almost like a, personal journal slash self-help slash educational. I don't know, lots of slashes. I feel like I should be in Guns N' Roses or something. But ultimately, I think today's episode, the last episode included my very first guest, Bruce Wojcik, and thank you, Bruce. I thought that was a great episode. People really, really enjoyed that, and I got some great feedback from it. And I certainly will have some more guests. Of the 3 episodes that I put up so far, the one about losing a local election just didn't seem to resonate with people, and I get that. I mean, really, unless you've run for local office, that topic may not resonate with you. It may if you're just into politics or considering getting into politics. This episode, though, is fairly personal, and I've entitled it Confessions of a Special Education Teacher because I am a special education teacher. And over the years, I will get into, kind of how I became a special education teacher. But before I go any further, it amazes me how many times people will come up to me and they'll ask like what my day job is, and I'll say, well, I teach special education, 6 1-to-1, which 6 1-to-1 is 6 students maximum, unless you get a variance, which sometimes you get 7 or 8. But ultimately, it's 6 students, 1 teacher aide. And people will say, oh, God bless your heart so much for being a special education teacher and working with those kids. And I don't think that people necessarily mean that in a way that is derogatory or putting students down. They may not mean it that way, but it kind of feels that way sometimes. And I don't really need to be thanked for being a special education teacher. There are some distinct advantages in being a special education teacher over even being a traditional high school teacher. Now, I say that because just to qualify that statement, I didn't spend a lot of time as a traditional teacher. I was a substitute teacher in a traditional school setting. I did some extensive student teaching in a traditional teacher setting, but my actual professional full-time teaching career, it's all been special education, 6 1-to-1. And it wasn't by design. I mean, ultimately, I had touched on this a little bit on the episode of how to lose a local election. I had been blacklisted by a regional superintendent, and I won't go. Someday I may tell that whole story. I think it'd probably be boring to most people. And so I really had to start looking, and I had some other factors going against me. When I entered teaching, I was 41 years old. And I think people like to pretend that when you're 41 years old, that there's no such thing as age discrimination or that kind of thing, but it exists. And I think a lot of times I was in a situation where, I'd apply for a teaching position. They look at the resume and they'd say, oh, here's this young guy out of college. He's ready to interview. And then I show up and it's like this 41-year-old bald dude, overweight. And it's like, that's not what I was expecting when I was going to ask to interview this person. And it's after I got my college diploma at such a late age, this was a constant. I'd show up and I kind of got used to that look of shock, like, oh goodness. Even the current position I'm in, when I showed up, they were a bit surprised at my age. But in fact, I had a guy the other day, one of my coworkers, he says to me, he's like, how old are you, Jennings? I said, 55. He's like, damn, you are old. It's like, yeah, thanks a lot, bud. that, but ultimately I think that as much as people don't like to say it, and again, this is just my general observation, I feel like at least a lot of the coworkers that I had, it almost felt somewhat like the land of misfit toys. All of us really, for the most part, wanted to teach in a traditional education setting, but special education was kind of what we either fell into or it was the only job available. And there's a lot of, really high turnover in these 6 1-to-1 schools because then people talk about the stressors and all that other stuff. But what I found is that when you have a classroom setting of a maximum of 6 students and a coworker in a classroom with you in the form of a teacher's aide, that it really affords you an opportunity to forge some really meaningful relationships with your students, which you may not get in a setting where you have 25 or 30 students. So my daughter-in-law, she teaches at a public school in Buffalo, New York, and we have conversations about her job, and obviously there's some similarities between the two of us in terms of interactions with students and the gradings and the state requirements and all those types of things that come along with it. But her stressors are very different than mine because she has such a large workload because there are just so many students that she has to deal with on a regular basis. So whereas I may have students that have greater needs, and it's interesting because I think the term special needs makes it sound like, their needs are just so much more special than anybody else's. I think it's a bit of a misnomer because a lot of these kids don't have special needs. They have the same needs that any other student has. They have greater needs they need greater support in some cases. They need a more meaningful relationship with staff in some cases. And this isn't just a bunch of idealistic gobbledygook. I live this stuff. And I left teaching for about 4 years and didn't think I wanted to go back because I thought it was just burning me out. But I'll tell you, it was never the students. It was always just the bureaucracy and everything else that came along with it that ultimately was the most difficult thing to deal with. The students, they're the least of your problems. Are their behaviors extraordinary in some cases? Well, sure. But if at least you have a basic understanding of what drives those behaviors, you'll be okay. It's the hardest thing to overcome in the beginning of a special education career is not taking everything personally. And in fact, when I interviewed for this current job, somebody said to me, and one of the interview questions was like, well, how are you going to handle it when a student targets you? I said, well, look at me. I'm short, I'm fat, I'm bald, I'm old. I'm a walking target. Like, I get it. And trust me, I get called those things on a regular basis. Not a week goes by that there's not some kind of insult flying at me from a student. Do I take it personally? Well, sure. Unless you're a robot, you're not gonna feel anything. But I don't take it deeply personally because in some cases I know where it's coming from. I've had students that have been repeatedly sexually abused. I've had students that have been burned by cigarette butts. I have students that have never had a real adult in their life in terms of a stable relationship. They've gone from foster home to foster home. I've had kids that have lost their parents at a young age and then nobody wanted them. So I don't necessarily take these things personally, and I think in many cases these kids have a right to be angry because they've been given a tough life. And but the flip side of that is that I think one of the reasons that I'm able to be effective in terms of relationship building, which is a different skill set than being a great teacher, is that I don't feel sorry for them per se. Sure, I feel sorry for them, but I don't feel sorry for them to the point where they know I feel sorry for them, that I treat them as if they're a victim. I treat them as if they were a student, which is what they are. And I think on some level, that's the most important thing you can do in special education, because unfortunately, the world is a pretty cruel place. And you have to set them up to be able to cope with the hand that they've been dealt, which sometimes is pretty awful. But the more important part is that they have to know that there are people out there that don't want to hurt them, that really do care about them, and help them build relationships and build trust. I mean, if every single adult in your life has treated you like garbage, what are you going to do to every adult in your life? You're going to push them away because you're just going to assume they all treat you like garbage. And until you have something else to contrast that with, that's going to be your life. That's how these kids are. And I say that, I don't want to stereotype students in special education, because they're just like any other human being. There's so many different complexities. There's levels of behavior. There's different diagnoses. There's no cookie cutter special education student. That word that I hate, special education. And, as I said, there's so many aspects of it that have just been incredibly rewarding. And just a lot of crazy things, though. But there's a lot of things I think that are kind of disturbing. I originally intended to kind of give you an insight into sort of what it was like to teach in a particular school. And the first place that I worked at, if you looked up my resume, you could probably figure out where it is. It was in Rochester, New York. I'm not going to name the name, but I kind of stumbled across it as in terms of employment by mistake. There was a career fair, and as I mentioned, I'd gotten out of college at age 41. I was having a really hard time finding a teaching job. So I actually took a job for a year as a telephone banker. So, like the guy that you call up and go, "Hi, this is Jane Doe. Can you tell me if check number 117 cleared?" And, the other thing we used to get a lot is that people would say, "I don't understand why this check bounced. My paycheck was going in on Friday." And the check came out on Thursday. "Well, my paycheck comes every Friday." No, sir. Everything is automated. We don't know that your check is coming out. But anyhow, that's the type of work I was doing. And for that first year, it was very frustrating, thinking that I'd spent all this time and as an adult gone back to school and got a college degree. And it was just feeling very high on myself. And I figured that everybody in the world would want me as a teacher because I had great grades. My GPA was 3.6, and I worked hard. I really did. But I was at this career fair, and at this point, I was kind of like, the way it worked is you were able to pick, I think, 3 or 4 districts that you could interview at these giant career fairs. And the place that I eventually was employed by, they weren't even on my radar. They actually had to happen to be the table next to a district that I really wanted to work at. And they were, I think, one letter off. So alphabetically, they were the one before the one that I had interviewed with. So we did, and it was kind of like these big interview events were like speed dating. You sit down and they just throw about 8 questions at you, and you go from there. And my degree was in social studies, and social studies teachers really fall into 2 categories. They're either a coach or they're a coach. I'm kidding. They're either a coach or not a coach. If you're not a coach, you're probably not going to get hired in a traditional school setting. At least that's how it used to be. A lot of times your football coaches and other sports coaches would be social studies or phys ed majors. And I don't know if the statistics bear that out. This is all based on my personal experience. But it was a question that came up, if I had a coaching background, which I did, but it was at the peewee level. I never coached at the high school level. So a lot of these places were really looking for teachers. And a lot of places used to just, I had a neighbor who's social studies teacher. He's the head football coach of that district that my kids went to and grew up with the kids. And he's an excellent football coach, and he's a social studies teacher. But I knew when he went into teaching that's what he wanted to be, was a football coach first, and then a teacher maybe second. So it worked out for him. Anyhow, I interviewed with this guy. His name's Earl. And I don't have anything bad to say about Earl. So, Earl, if you're listening, thank you. But the funny thing is, I remember the one question that he asked. It was one of those trip-up interview questions. It says, finish the sentence. Diversity is... And the first thing that popped in my head was reality. And he says, good answer. So I don't know if that was the tipping point for me to go to the next stage of the interview process, but, whatever the case, I wound up getting hired. And so this was one of those deals. It was a not-for-profit agency. They had what they call an RTF, which is a residential treatment facility, which is where students, or young people, I should say, young people were actually residing there. And they fell into two distinct categories. One of them was like a juvenile justice program. And I think New York State was at this point, New York State was trying to close up a lot of the juvenile detention centers. So they were, the agency I work for, the way basically a lot of these not-for-profits work in New York State is they get a contract with the state. So if it's cheaper to put them at a place like this not-for-profit, they'll do it. The not-for-profit makes money, which is not-for-profit, interesting. They always manage to pay CEOs profitable wages, but that's a topic for another day. And the students that I worked with, for the most part, were the residential treatment facility, which were students with mental health diagnoses. And occasionally we'd have students that were diagnosed with Asperger's and things like that. But for the most part, that's what it was. It was students that had mental health issues and needed a higher level of treatment. So they would get counseling. They have access to a psychologist and people to monitor their medication. And then the school was actually on the campus where these young people lived. So they just, shame is no snow days because they literally had to walk across the parking lot. And we also taught summers there. And it was funny during the interview process, the Earl asked me, he says, well, what do you think about working summers? I'm like, dude, I'm 42 years old at this point. I've worked summers my entire life. So as much as I would love to have summers off, it's just a reality. That's just not in the cards for me. So so we went, training and everything like that. And you go through all these, you go to college and they teach you all these different ways to teach students. And it's funny, by the time you get into the classroom, a lot of teachers will tell you like none of this stuff is really practical. And some of it's taught to you by people that haven't taught in a classroom for 25 years. And much of it wasn't even going to be relevant to me because I was going to be in a very different atmosphere than, say, somebody that was working in a large public school system. Now, my first day at this particular school, this campus school, I really didn't know what to expect. And I was hired to work. I was going to start in July, so I was actually going to start in the summer session. And I get into the building, and it looked like this. It almost looked very institutional. That's the word that a lot of people I know, even coworkers, had used to describe it. A lot of this... it looked like the inside of a hospital / jail. It was really just a kind of a dreary looking place, which was odd because it hadn't been there for a very long time. I think it was built in the early 80s. But they also had these, I don't know what they called them at the time, like comfort rooms or time away rooms. And they were padded rooms. They literally just, they were like something out of, like a horror movie about a mental health institution. And they had at least one on every floor. And there was one I remember on the school was 3 floors. I remember the one on the second floor. The one on the second floor was the one that seemed to get used the most. And this thing was just like those just padded walls, padded floor. And you can only imagine, just based on how many different bodily fluids had been rolling around on the pads, like how these things smelled. They were like a locker room after a wrestling team had rolled around and not showered for a month. It was just the smell was atrocious. I would probably go to a funeral home embalming for fresh air. It would be a better smell than these rooms. They were just awful. And that one in particular was just filled with graffiti. And there was, when they shut the kids in the room, and this is back in 2008, so 2009-ish. I think things have changed, but I don't know. I don't know. I'm not there anymore, so I haven't been there in quite some time. But they just throw the kids in the room and close the door. They'd scream at the top of their lungs. It was just incredible. And so you really had to, it was just such a culture shock on my end. I'd never seen a padded room before. I always thought of padded rooms as something that was archaic. It was back in, the early 1900s when you had insane asylums. And I'm not trying to be too judgmental here. I guess there's a therapeutic reason for everything that's done. But I hated those things. I hated those rooms. I hated the way they smelled. They were dark. It just felt like if a kid was getting too out of control and they threw him in there, it was really just, I didn't necessarily see the therapeutic component of it. And I saw we had kids, the kids that I taught were high school age, but the school itself had some younger kids as well. And it was just the little ones too. They'd stick them in this room, and sometimes the staff, if they couldn't deal with an unruly kid, they'd tackle them or whatnot. And when you teach in special education, I believe actually when you're a teacher of any kind, you're what's called a mandated reporter, which means that any form of suspected abuse, you have to report to the state. And a lot of these situations were very gray areas. And as much as this mandated reporter system exists to protect students, the reality is, if there's a situation where a staff member may be manhandling or person handling, I don't know if that the gender things have changed on that, but if they're handling a student in an improper way, and it's your obligation, legal obligation, to report that, and you're the only one that saw it, it's not going to take a rocket scientist to figure out who reported it. So you're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. And I used to see this happen all the time. So you'd have an allegation of abuse that was reported by a staff member. They'd report it to the state. The state would come and investigate. If it was a favored staff member, they'd figure out which person reported it, and that person's life would be made a living hell. That's the way it went. And again, this is all my personal experience. Does it happen in other places? I don't know. I suspect it does, but I can't prove it. But I saw it happen myself all the time. So, did I ever have to report suspected child abuse? Well, I'm not going to go on record to tell you whether I did or not. You can draw your own conclusions. But legally, if I saw abuse, I was obligated to report it. And for the most part, though, I want to back up. For the most part, people that are in these types of environments, they don't abuse kids. Unfortunately, it's like, you look at the situation with Catholic priests and the Boy Scouts and all that, there's always going to be a rogue element, just disgusting, despicable people that are going to abuse people. And of course, they're going to work in organizations where there's children, because that's what predators do. They go to where their prey is. But anyhow, I don't want to turn this into an entirely dark episode about special education. So made it to the school. Again, it was just kind of weird. The rooms were pretty small. The students were entirely different to anything I've ever dealt with in my life. And even the teachers too. As I said, I think all of us had our own kind of reasons for being there, whether it was the fact that we couldn't necessarily fit into the public school setting. Some people were there short term because it was the first job that they could get, and eventually moved on to the public school setting. And, the students, the difficult part is that when you have students with special needs, that word that I hate, we'll say students with mental health disabilities, that they already are suspect of adults, relationships, and all those types of things. And unfortunately, due to the nature of teaching special education, working in an RTF and all that kind of stuff, the staff cycles through a lot. So it just perpetuates this notion that adults don't stick around to help. And then there was a lot of times that students would say to me, hey, the only reason you're here is because you're getting a paycheck. You're not here because you care about me. And that's a pretty tough pill to swallow. I mean, maybe there's some truth to that. I mean, I can't say that I would necessarily volunteer at an RTF facility to work with kids with mental health issues. And as I said, I left teaching for 5 years because I had some burnout. And so I get it. And again, that's that point where you have to be really introspective. And that's what these students are facing too, is this, they find a staff, they connect with them. And that agency that I worked with, they had a very strict policy on if the student left the facility, you were not to be in contact with them. And that was because of issues related to abuse. There were people that were forging relationships with kids, and really all it was grooming. And then they'd turn around and they'd abuse the kids after they got out of the agency. And the sad part is that there were plenty of people that could have a great relationship with the kids after they left the agency, show them that adults do care, but they couldn't because of a particular rule. And these are people that would never abuse a kid, that could be a great influence in their lives. And I actually do maintain contact with some of my former students. They're in their late 20s now, and we're able to, and I'm able to see some of them grow up and do really, really well. And very proud of them. Very proud to say that I was their teacher. Same as I said, special education, general education, traditional, whatever you want to call it. It's all the same. You got a student. If you're teaching for even a little bit of the right reason, you feel pride when your students do well, and you feel hurt when they don't. So I will. I'm a good 27 minutes in, so I will share the story of one of my earliest and most interesting student. I think there was a lot of lessons to be learned here. And, let me tell you another story. I think we'll be able to do a few of these episodes on special education because it's an important topic. And I think that societally, we need to pay a little bit more attention to what goes on in these schools, good, bad, and indifferent. If people aren't watching what's going on, then nothing will change. And I know that there's this perception that all kids that are stuck in a special education school, they don't have terrible parents and blah, blah, blah. Not true. Not true at all. There's many parents that are so heavily invested, excuse me. There's many parents that are so heavily invested in their kids' education. It's mind-blowing. It's inspirational is what it is. And I'm not saying that to, kiss butt and pretend that, I want to make sure that all parents out there with students with special needs feel wanted. Hey, listen, you know who you are. It's not easy raising kids. They all have special needs. Every single last one of them. But some of them have more needs that have to be met. And you see these parents that just put their heart and soul into their kids' education and into their kids' lives. And there's always a few rogues. There's people that'll put on a show and all that kind of stuff. And there's some terrible tales of rotten parenting. But again, I don't know that the percentages of good to rotten parents is any different in a special education setting than it is in a traditional education setting. And you can't blame the parents for everything. Also, you got to remember that. You can't blame the teachers for everything. Ultimately, but we should all have the same goal. We need to work together. And when you have a student who doesn't have an active parent in their life and they're in special education, yeah, that's a recipe for disaster. It's not a good thing. So that'll actually kind of transition nicely into a student that I had, one of my very first students, and I'll tell you the story. And there's some parts of it that you look back on now that are a little bit of a chuckle. And I received a call from my current boss, and she was talking to me about a particular student whose parent was concerned that they were taking our participation in government class. at the high school level, and they were discussing the Second Amendment, which has to do with guns. And this particular student, just because of his mental health issues, he had a very difficult time with that particular topic. So that's kind of the balancing act that you deal with. But yeah, I said every teacher deals with that. I mean, some subjects are just more sensitive than others. So I had this student, his name was, we'll call him Carlos. I will change his first name to protect the innocent. But Carlos came to me, and he was in one of my first classes. And that summer session, as I said, I'd started in the summer. And I had asked Earl, I said, Earl, well, I'm a social studies teacher. What am I going to be teaching over the summer? He goes, well, summer is just really to kind of help the kids not fall out of routine of going to school. And that's pretty typical. The reason that the kids attend summer school for the most part is because taking X amount of time off, there could be a significant regression in their learning. That's not always the case, but it can be. I mean, I get the reasoning behind it. And there are exceptions to that rule, but we don't need to go down that bunny trail. Anyhow, so Carlos was in my class, and I said to Earl, what can I teach? He says, just teach some kind of topic that you think that the kids would find interesting. Just keep them busy over the summer. Just make sure they're learning something. So, easy choice, World War II. World War II covers a lot of history. It's got a lot of tentacles, European history, American history, world history. It just goes everywhere because there were so many nations that were involved in it. And it was a topic that I was very familiar with. Read a lot of books on World War II and the Depression and the New Deal and all that. And so first day, we got out of, it might have even been a VHS tape, probably not, 2008. I don't know, whatever. Got a movie out about World War II. I put the thing into the thing that's broadcasting it on the television set. And they start showing all these newsreel films, everything like that. And this thing with Hitler comes up, and then Carlos stands up, throws up a Nazi salute. I'm like, what the heck is this? I'm just looking at him like, what are you doing? He's like, Heil Hitler. I'm like, Heil Hitler? Like, Carlos, what's going on here? He's like, I just think Hitler was the greatest leader ever. Germany's economy was great under Hitler. All those tired old arguments. And I didn't expect that. I just didn't. I mean, who would expect that the kid was in 9th grade at the time. And so I'm a little stymied, but as is evidenced by the fact that I'm able to talk at 45 minutes a clip for a podcast episode, I'm not one that's going to back down from a discussion. I'm not. Honestly, I don't like arguments. Like, I don't necessarily like back and forth. I like discussions, and there's a difference. Trust me, big difference, especially when you're a teacher. And when you're a teacher, you don't want to argue. You'll never win because kids are much better at arguing than adults because they don't ever stop. They're young enough that they're like, hey man, my heels are dug in. I call it the Tiananmen Square. Like the guy standing in front of the tank. You're not going to win until you run them over. Which you can't, because that would be abuse. But anyhow, so Carlos Carlos made it his life's ambition to argue with me the merits of Hitler and Hitler's final solution, and he supposedly had read Mein Kampf, and every day the discussions between us about it, every day, like no matter what, through that whole summer. So at one point, now every student here, special education student, they have a couple of things. One's called an IEP, which is an individualized education plan, and that means if there's something that they need to give them assistance, whether it's a little bit extra time on tests or whatever. But those individualized education plans, they really have to be followed. And Carlos had his and everything, but there's usually an advocate. Each kid had a counselor as well. So I get called into this meeting. I think we're about 4 weeks into the summer session, and I get called into this room. It's about the size of a closet. There's a circular table in it, and I don't know what the meeting's about. So they sit down and said, we got some concerns about Carlos. I go, okay, well, what are they? Well, you're teaching about World War II over the summer session, correct? Yeah. We were wondering if you could do that course without mentioning Hitler. And I looked at the therapist and I said, no, I actually can't. Like, and the room's just kind of silent. Everybody's looking at me. And it was one of those weird situations where they're like, oh, well, why can't you? And I mean, I suppose, I mean, I hope that people out there listening to me are going, that's just the craziest thing I've ever heard. And it's because it was absolutely crazy. And I understood that Carlos had a bit of a psychosis and a weird obsession with Hitler. He had a weird obsession with Charlie Manson. He had a weird obsession with a lot of people. I work with a student right now who's got a weird obsession with Joseph Stalin. You know, I don't get it. But I felt like on some level we couldn't ignore it. I mean, I can't pretend that Hitler didn't happen. And it's not because I was digging my heels in for some kind of academic freedom or anything like that. I honestly felt like I was selling the kid short if I didn't teach him an accurate history of World War II, which he obviously knew who Hitler was. This kid knew a lot about Hitler, but he did need to at least be educated on World War II enough to pass a Regents exam, because unless a student has a really compelling reason not to take the same exams as students in a traditional school setting, they got to pass that test. And I just was, and in all honesty, and I tried to explain this to these people at the meeting, but it's just one of those weird challenges that comes up in education. I said, hey, I appreciate it, but if we don't talk about Hitler, there's going to be somebody else. Somebody's going to come up. History is filled with all kinds of weird and pretty awful people. And we need to be able to have some very frank discussions about it. But Carlos, man, I mean, for the next, I think I taught him for about the next 2 years. And I mean, the kid just absolutely drove me nuts. And it was just every day we just get into some back and forth discussion. I was really the only person that he had that would even entertain just some of his nonsensical rants about, Charles Manson and whatever. And a really interesting episode happened with him. It was around Christmas time. At Christmas time, we used to have our library at the school. People would donate gifts, and a lot of these kids came from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, so they'd have a room filled with all these toys and adult gifts and everything, so that they could pick out some gifts for their siblings and then their caregivers or their parents, depending on who they lived with. And Carlos had to go down during my class period, so I took him down, and he's looking through stuff, and all he's doing is picking out stuff for himself. And I'm just thinking, man, that's Carlos, man. Just always Carlos is just about Carlos. And he shows me this pen, and he hands it to me, and he says, Mr. Jennings, what do you think of this pen? I go, well, that's a nice pen. And he said, okay, well, that's cool. I'm glad you like it. So after they picked out all their stuff, they had to bring it to a table to get it wrapped, and then they put gift tags on it to all the different people. So Carlos walks up to the table. He's got like a pile of stuff. And they're like, well, Carlos, what do you need wrapped? He said, just the pen. I'm like, oh, well, that's interesting. So all the other stuff he was just keeping for himself. And then that my mother, may she rest in peace, my mother always used to get Christmas gifts for the kids, and so I'd bring those in, and I brought in Christmas gifts for all my students as well. So between my mother's gifts and all that other stuff, I'd given all this stuff to the kids. And you always hope that somebody's going to give you a Christmas gift, one of your students. And it's not a guarantee. I mean, I've had years where I've had a fair amount of them, and I had years where I've had none. So this year I had one student give me a gift. It was on my desk, and it was wrapped, and it was that pen, and it was Carlos. Yeah. Carlos had given me the pen. I was the only person that he bought a Christmas gift for. And it was such a moment of like, wow. So I guess on some level, I reached this kid. I don't know. It was bizarre. And I felt very conflicted because on some level, I felt like we had a very combative relationship. As much as I say, we would have discussions. I mean, of course, discussion and argument. I mean, there's a very thin line between it. And it was just a weird moment. But then, the other thing is that he, in his hate, Hitler targeted the Jewish people. And I grew up in a community with lots of Jewish friends, and I think it gave me just a very weird perspective on the Holocaust, because I just never, ever, ever understood where, how Hitler could tap into hate. I mean, I've read in later years, as I got older, that a lot of hate has to do with whether you have exposure to a particular race or not. So I think since I grew up around a lot of Jewish people, I didn't have that negative opinion of them. I mean, they just were neighbors. There were plenty of people that I hung out with that were Jewish. I didn't know they were Jewish until much later. It just wasn't on my radar. I just didn't care. So I always found that whole targeting Jewish people as being kind of weird. But Carlos had this unhealthy obsession against homosexuals. And so he would constantly be spewing this anti-homosexual rhetoric and relating it back to Hitler. And honestly, I haven't really studied Hitler enough to know if Hitler was as massively anti-homosexual as Karl was. But it was I just found it weird. I found it very strange. So as it turned out, Carlos wound up getting in trouble for having a homosexual relationship with a minor, and he was eventually arrested for it. He's a registered sex offender now. But when I had that discussion with somebody, I was telling, they mentioned the fact that there was a student that wouldn't, the parents didn't want them to be taught about the Second Amendment because of guns. I went and kind of looked up Carlos to see where he was at now and everything. And saw him on the sex offender registry and everything. And then he was also a volunteer for the Gay Alliance, which I was like, I'm not gonna make any excuses for a sexual predator. I mean, he's a registered sex offender, but there was a part of me that looked at it and said, I'm glad to see that he's at least comfortable enough in his skin to be outwardly homosexual. I don't know at what point he felt like he couldn't be, and I think there's a part of me that likes to think that maybe his extreme hatred of homosexuality was more a hatred of himself, and how at that point, even in 2008, even in the psychiatric community, I don't think there was any kind of there was real total acceptance of homosexuality. So, I don't know where the guy's working. I mean, there was something, I think it said that he was working at Burger King as a maintenance person or whatever, but it appears he hasn't. I mean, I don't know. Either way, I said it's a strange thing, but that's kind of the things that you deal with and I imagine that somebody that's a prison guard, maybe they get along with somebody. I used to talk to people that worked with Mark David Chapman, who was the assassin of John Lennon, and they'd say, Mark David Chapman's not a bad guy. I mean, he's a real easy prisoner to work with, and if he killed anybody else but John Lennon, he'd probably be out right now. But it just strikes me where I think, man, I mean, how can I think positively about a guy that murdered one of my favorite musicians of all time? I mean, but I'm not around him. I don't know what kind of person he is. And so I think we deal with those conflicts in terms of how we feel about people. And as I said, in the case of Carlos, I mean, I still deal with some of those conflicting emotions because, I mean, the kid drove me insane. He did. I mean, we just argued back and forth. I mean, there were days I would just come home, I'd be mentally exhausted because of the back and forth about, all this Hitler stuff. And I mean, the kid knew about eugenics. I mean, on some level, he was very bright for his age, but it was like, man, I look back and I go, man, was this all just because of some deep-seated conflict in terms of his sexuality? And this kid had nobody in his life. He really just had nobody in terms of a caregiver. And because of his argumentative nature and everything, it was very difficult for him to forge any kind of relationship. And it's just bizarre for me to think that the only relationship that he found even meaningful that one Christmas was with this teacher that all they did was go back and forth about, Hitler, Manson, all, hating races, all this other stuff. And Carlos just got beat up a fair amount too by some other students because he would target them because of their race or sexual orientation or things like that. And I mean, you can protect these kids to a certain level, but if somebody's going to go after them and want to hurt them physically, they'll do it. And on some level, Carlos really seemed to get some kind of joy out of it. Like he would start these fights, and if somebody hit him, the kid never hit back. Like he knew, like he was smart enough to know that if somebody had hit him and he didn't retaliate, that the other person would be the one that would be punished, and he wouldn't. It's incredible. So I don't know, criminal mastermind, genius, child with a difficult history. It's hard. There's so many gray areas there. You just don't even know what to think. But those are the types of things that people that work in environments with students that have these very complex pasts are confronted with on a daily basis. How to show tough love, how to provide structure, but provide it in a way that's positive and meaningful. And there's just no cookie cutter way to do it. And then at the end of the day, you're a teacher. The kids need to be educated. They have to have the ability to pass exams and do all those other things that all of us are expected to do in society, even with all of these different challenges that are going on in their lives. So, I don't know. I hope it gives you a little bit of an interesting perspective on challenges. Again, mine are probably, some of them are unique, some of them not so much. But I think it's important again that this again will be a subject that I'll certainly revisit. But I think it's an important issue. I think it's something that people should pay a little bit closer attention to, understand how the system works, good, bad, and indifferent. And if you see a teacher, a special education teacher, you don't have to say, "Oh, bless your soul for working with these students," because it's what we do. It's what we do, and it's like anything. There's a love-hate relationship with it. You work a job. You gotta work. You gotta get paid. You gotta do all the other stuff. But that's not to say I couldn't do something else. I absolutely could do something else. I did for years, but I, for whatever reason, am where I need to be, and I think that that same can be said for a lot of the teachers out there that are doing what I do. And I guess that's it. So I'll close up with saying thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. We'll definitely get some more guests on. And if you want to be a guest, please feel free to reach out to me. The email address is on the page. I really could use some reviews. I could use some shares. I could use some constructive criticism. Anything that you want to throw my way, I will accept so that I can continue to just spout my, whatever you want to call it, my bagel logic. All right. And maybe someday we'll actually just do an episode on how to make a bagel. But once again, thanks for listening. This is your host, Thom Jennings of Bagel Logic, and we'll see you next time.